Hi all, and welcome back to part 3 of lesson 3. In this part, we're going to be talking about object types. So over the past couple of videos, we've talked about a lot of different kind of objects. We talked about numbers and booleans and strings, and in just the past couple of videos, we talked about lists. Now it's time to start thinking about how these different objects interact with one another and how we know what we're seeing when we see it, right? So here's an example. We have an integer, a float, a complex value, a boolean, a string, and a list. And in order to test what each of these things are, we can actually use the type function. So here we use type, put parentheses, and then you put the thing that you want to test. So in this case, we are testing each of these examples. And you can see the output, it gives you a class and it tells you what that thing is. This can be helpful for knowing where to go with a certain piece of data and making the data work better for you. Speaking of making the data work better for you, you can actually change the data type in order to make things fit a little bit better. First off, you can change an object to an integer using the function int with parentheses. And here an example, we have a float, a string, and a boolean. And when we perform the int function on each of them, we get a 12 for the float here. Notice it just drops that decimal, so pretty much just performs a floor. I get a 15, so it just takes the numbers out of the string. And then for false, once we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about booleans, but false is 0, true is a 1, right? There are cases where this int function doesn't work. If your variable is a complex object, if your variable is a list, if your variable is a non-numeric string, meaning it has letters in it, and if your variable is a numeric string with a decimal in it. In that case, it would be a float. To change an object into a float, you use the function float with the parentheses. Here are some examples. We have an integer, a string, and a boolean. We perform the float function on each of them, and you can see for the integer, it just adds a 0.0. For the string, once again, it just takes the numbers out of the string. And for the false, it gives you a 0, but because it's a float, you have a 0.0 as well. And you can see the type is float for each of those. There are cases where this doesn't work, cases where your variable is a complex object, your variable is a list, or your variable is a non-numeric string. To change an object into a complex value, you use the function complex, pretty intuitive. And here are some examples, 575, integer, string, bool. And you perform the complex function on each of those, and you print those out, and you can see that it pretty much just adds this 0j component. Basically, it's just adding a complex component to any of the numbers. There are cases where this doesn't work, of course, if your variable is a list or if your variable is a non-numeric string, very similar to any of the other numbers. To change an object into a Boolean, you use the function bool. Here are my examples here. So I have an integer, a string, a list, and a float. And you can see that whenever we perform the Boolean function on each of those, we get true, true, false, and false. Note that only objects that are empty or 0 will produce a false. Everything else will produce a true. This means that there are no cases where this doesn't work because there's always either something or not something. And if there's not something, it's a false. If there is something, it's a true, which means it's always a Boolean. To change an object into a string, you use the function str with the parentheses, and that pretty much just puts quotes around whatever object you're putting it into. So here we have an integer, a complex, a Boolean, and a float, and we do a string for all of them, and you can't really see it with the print statements, but now they're pretty much just all strings with quotes around them. And you can see with the type, there's the class, all of them are strings. There are no cases where this doesn't work. You can put pretty much anything you want to into a string. Finally, to change any object into a list, you just use square brackets and put the thing you want to change inside of the square brackets. For example, we have an integer, a string, Boolean, and a float. And for each of those, we just put square brackets around them. And for that, you can just see we just create a list with this one item in it, basically. To change iterable objects, basically just objects with length, the things we've learned about being lists and strings, you can actually use list function. And in that case, it actually takes each component and breaks it out into a single item for the list. So you can see it takes the 1 here, the 6 here, the decimal, the 9, and the 2. So it takes each character and breaks it into a list item. There are no cases where this doesn't work. You can put anything to a list as well. That's all for this video. It's a little bit shorter because the other two were kind of long. We will see you shortly for part 4, logical operations.